Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today for this live Gapsquare webinar on pay equity and transparency. My name is Robert Shaw. I'm part of the Market Insights team at Gapsquare and XpertHR, and I will be your host. I'd like to begin by introducing you to our speakers, Loew and Sabina Mehmood. Laci is XpertHR's Senior Global Analyst, HR Strategy and Insights, and a member of the Forbes Human Resources Council. Laci partners with senior global HR and business leaders to improve the measurable impact of people and business processes by utilizing evidence-based insights and analytics to inform strategic and sustainable actions. Welcome, Laci.
Thank you.
And Sabina is the pay equity leader at Gapsquare. Sabina works alongside Zara Nanu, CEO of Gapsquare, who unfortunately isn't able to join us today, has a global voice on the evolving landscape of pay transparency and the data driving a fairer future of work. With a background in sustainable finance and social data reporting, Sabina works with organizations to draw the connections between fundamental pay equity and broader workplace inequalities for the purpose of overcoming them. Sabina, hello. Sabina and Laci will be sharing findings from the latest Executive Network and XpertHR study showing why pay equity and transparency are crucial to improving the impact of business strategy and employer brand. A digital version of the study findings is available for you to download from the link in the chat on the right-hand side of your screen. Once they've shared their insights, I should say that Laci and Sabina will be available to answer questions in a Q&A segment at the end of the session. Some of you have submitted questions already, for which many thanks. If you haven't and you'd still like to, then please do so by using the panel on the right of your screen. I should also note that our speakers are in different parts of the globe today. Hopefully we won't have any technical issues, but if we do, then please bear with us and we will resolve it as rapidly as possible. And with that, I'm going to hand over to our speakers, Laci and Sabina. Are you ready?
Yes, thank you so much, Robert. So let's just dive right in. We have a full hour. With the gender reporting pay gap deadline just behind us, our efforts toward a fairer future of work must not stop there. Globally, the discussion of pay equity and transparency is at an all-time high. A previously opaque area of social data reporting, now truly in the spotlight here at home. And for multinational listeners, we also see this increasing in the US with state-level transparency laws and across the EU with the latest CSRD reporting requirements. But what does it really mean in practice? What does a fair future of work look like for ourselves, for our employees? Surely it's more than just our numbers published on the Government Equality's homepage. My goodness, those numbers we've been reporting for 8 years now. And so as we inch closer to the 10-year mark for GPG reporting requirements across the country, we're still seeing pay inequity as a key barrier to equality in our workplaces, and even less financial and economic inclusion of women and underrepresented populations. Despite continued talk about the need to solve pay inequities, actual progress with fully closing pay gaps is slow at best. For employees themselves, public reporting is great, but with the cost of living skyrocketing in the very recent past, in practice, employees and even leaders themselves are faced with incredible challenges. Let's look at a practical example. A study published just last week by Credit Karma found rising cost of childcare is driving 1 in 3 Brits out of their careers. These findings are especially daunting if you're raising children alone, and like many in the UK, without family support to step in and help. There are nearly 3 million lone parent families here, which accounts for more than 15% of families in the UK overall. And the new government childcare support measures announced in the recent budget, well, they don't come into effect until next year. So in light of this, addressing pay inequity must mean more than just addressing base pay. We must look at the entire employee value proposition within an organization and consider inclusive policies and benefits that address elements such as childcare support and a living wage over minimum wage. So in plain English, it's more than just the right thing to do. Pay equity is a business imperative. I'm going to say that again. Pay equity is a business imperative. Otherwise, we're driving our workers out of the workforce. So we believe human-centric companies that are forging ahead with comprehensive pay equity and transparency strategies are at an advantage. Rather than treating equitable pay practices as a checkbox exercise for compliance or determining compensation through some cloaked process hidden from most employees, these organizations are creating more equitable and inclusive systems and organizational cultures, leaving behind ineffective and outdated practices. Now, this is good for business. More sophisticated, transparent, and fair pay practices are a differentiator that will help attract and keep workers and build more committed, collaborative, and high-performing cultures. So today, Sabina and we're going to have a conversation about these very practices. We will share with you an overview of the key findings of our Global Pay Equity and Transparency survey and research, including what we're hearing from leaders and from employees regarding these challenges and concerns. Sabina and I will offer our insights, we'll point out critical calls to action, and share winning practices essential for instantiating practices that will help ensure a fair future of work. And finally, we'll close with a Q&A session addressing your specific questions. So let's get started. There are few who would argue with the notion that equity and transparency are business differentiators. Yet, as I just shared, many are not doing it well. To discover how high-performing organizations are executing effectively and what kind of results they are getting because they're doing so, together with Executive Networks, a senior HR peer community of Global 1,000 organizations, in January of this year, we conducted a global survey. More than 1,000 HR and business leaders and employees from varied industries and demographic groups participated in the survey. Half of those survey participants were based in the UK and half in the United States. We collected input from about 500 employees, 250 HR leaders, and 250 business leaders. The survey revealed strikingly different perspectives among respondents, as well as several key hurdles in order to achieve parity. So let's look at each of the key findings. Sabina, could you help us get started?
Absolutely, Laci, and thank you to the team for including me today. So Laci, exactly as you've already outlined, we really came to table with a question late last year into early this year, thinking about if organizations are really talking the talk or are they actually walking the walk, right? We know transparency is been top of mind across the UK, but we haven't necessarily seen the closing of the gaps that we would hope to have seen by now. And what our research shows overwhelmingly is that pay inequity is still a very real concern for employees themselves, even when the employers think that they've gotten it right. So this might not come as a surprise anecdotally, but now we really have some data to support the message. Who should own pay equity? Why does it matter? Alignment around the importance of this work is critical, and our study revealed some serious disconnect among senior leaders on these types of questions. So as the current state of the global economy leads companies to scale back non-critical business functions, making clear the long-range financial impact of pay inequity and transparency overall is essential. So between talent management, brand reputation, ultimately the bottom line, organizations plainly can't afford to shortchange their pay equity strategy or their people. And despite those stated commitments to pay equity and transparency, the results don't show the progress we'd hope to see or expect. Across all of those surveyed globally, 50% strongly agree that pay inequity still exists in their organization, and only less than 1 in 3 feel differently. And let's start with the tone from the top. So really this has to come down at the most senior levels, but touches every single person within the organization. So when it comes to the ownership of pay equity analyses themselves, right, so deep diving into that adjusted pay gap, the top answer for who should own this process was the CEO, both for business leaders and HR leaders. In this case, when we say HR, we mean those focusing on the people function, right, human resources, and general business leaders outside of that group. But business leaders are far more likely to call out the CEO, and HR leaders themselves are more evenly split across internal owners. And we know human resources most typically owns this data and owns the analysis, and that's where we see the most discourse, which is, a concerning first key finding. It really indicates that HR leaders may still think of pay equity as just solely a GPG or gender reporting pay gap requirement rather than a strategic business imperative, right? Keeping those cards close to chest as opposed to cross-function. So we can understand the motivators here. This is a sensitive topic, but it truly impacts everyone, and we're starting to see that affirmed by the data, right? We cannot argue with the numbers. So unfair pay practices are not without consequence, right? So from a legal implication, we see that as of course, but what we really also want to start to discuss more openly is the impact in a more inclusive and equitable culture, which really requires deep examination of where your organization is falling short and the implications, not only in the compliance space, but above and beyond. So HR and business leaders generally agree on the consequences of inaction of pay equity, with employee retention being the biggest issue and reduced productivity most often cited by business leaders. Leaders who continue to treat pay inequity as a one-off compliance issue, right, coming in with those reactive Band-Aid fixes, failing to prioritize this as mission critical work, they can continue to expect high turnover, low productivity, poor brand reputation, and compromised financial performance, right? I will underscore what you've already said, Laci. This is not just the right thing to do. It is business critical. So I'll take a step back for a moment. And my background, as Robert mentioned, is in the analytics space and thinking really about the data behind the scenes. But the quantitative analysis really is just one piece of a much larger puzzle when we think about workplace equality, right? We have to remember those people behind the numbers. So to supplement some of this work, we did have a qualitative component of the study that you and I conducted, Laci, with the wider executive network teams. We wanted to hear from employees, right? Understanding those people and individual voices behind the numbers. So the additional comments we found really suggest that even with laws in place to protect the discussion of pay, and perhaps as senior leadership team confident in their own pay philosophies, employees are just not seeing it. And they'll be quick to anonymously discuss blatant bias in decision-making, right? So a little bit behind the veil there. And I'll also call out the varying perspectives across generations, right? So even across generations, we're seeing favoritism, secrecy, and this idea of being cheeky and unfair, as one respondent says, really consistent throughout.
Like children, Sabina, we can always count on the employees to be honest with us, right? Anyways, yeah, despite the stated priorities around pay equity and transparency, as Sabina said, employees are not seeing the evidence that it really matters at their organizations. There's a significant gap, as you see in this slide, between leaders and employees' perceptions of how much of a priority pay equity and transparency really is at the organization in which they work. As you see on the left, most senior leaders say that their companies prioritize these initiatives, and on the right, less than half of employees agree. So from a lack of understanding about how pay is determined to limited visibility into how much pay inequity exists, it appears that organizations have not solved many of the inherent issues related to pay parity and transparency. So to create parity and close the gap, HR leaders need to make changes that are threaded through organizational practice and through culture and made visible to employees. Without clear systemic and visibility practices in place, it's going to be incredibly hard to make progress. And so, half of those surveyed on the next slide said that they want a better understanding of fair pay for their own role at their own organization. Even though senior leaders acknowledge the importance of pay transparency to build an equitable and inclusive culture, half of those same leaders say they themselves desire a clearer understanding of fair compensation for their own role. So lack of understanding about fair pay for one's role is not unique to only non-leaders. It prevails throughout all levels within an organization. So we asked leaders, what is driving the need for pay transparency? And this is what we heard. In the UK, Aside from the compliance as a critical driver to greater pay transparency, we also see globally the ESG agenda as a driving force of accountability. ESG meaning environmental, social, and governance data, reporting, and pay practices. And this pay equity and transparency discussion really aligns fully with that S component of ESG. Surveyed leaders said that, at least in part, organizational commitment to ESG strategies influences an organization's commitment to pay transparency. And that is particularly true, as you see on the left, in larger organizations. But let's unpack a bit of the reason why. Although globally, the initial focus of ESG was predominantly on environmental sustainability for external constituencies like shareholders and customers, ESG initiatives have expanded to address what is arguably the most important constituency, a company's employees. And pay transparency is one of those initiatives. So many leaders participating in our survey, they agreed that ESG influences their organization's pay practices. So, Sabina, this causes me to think about something, I wanted to ask you. ESG is a relatively new business differentiator, and getting clearer on how pay equity and transparency land squarely in the S, or the social component of ESG. How do you see organizations can think about connecting the dots between equity and transparency practices and their ESG strategy?
Absolutely. It's a great question. And in truth, it's really hard to draw an immediate connection. So we really want to think about big picture, what we're seeing in this space and how pay inequity is driving some of those fundamental themes that we do see headlining across the ESG agenda. And if I'm honest with you, we are also starting to see a lot of criticism in the headlines globally around this environmental, social, and governance data reporting landscape, arguing the lack of data standardization and transparency is standing in the way of truly achieving sustainability and an equitable workforce. What's unique in the UK, which we know, and we don't see this in other markets like the US, there is a level of standardization, right? We have that GPG reporting and the accountability component of public reporting, but it's the accountability piece itself that remains a gray area, right? And it's even cause for concern to think about impending regulation across the EU. You found a gap, you've published your gap, now what, right? Even with the GPG requirements, pay data globally is still the least disclosed social metric. But we can draw a connection between those fundamental barriers to pay, like I said, to nearly all of the public commentary on ESG themes, right? So, for example, if you see a public commitment to increasing female representation on your executive team, right? And we've seen this, thousands of companies globally have committed to this in the past 3 to 5 years, but fewer are actually addressing the fundamental pipeline barriers that stand in the way of achieving those goals, right? And pay is a fundamental pipeline barrier here. So when we look at the GPG reporting specifically, we can identify where talent lives in the organization. For example, you may say publicly in your ESG commitments, well, we're at parity. We have a 50% split on gender, for example, within the workforce. But when we start to think about where they sit with respect to quartile distribution among pay, right? How do we start to ensure that we're not only addressing parity, this 50-50 split or all-encompassing inclusive workforces, but starting to look at where that talent sits within the organization? Are they in those revenue-generating roles? Are they moving up within the organization? Is everyone across genders, race, ethnicity, et cetera, given the same opportunity to succeed within the organization? And many, truthfully, struggle to where to start internally, which we know is critical before you can go out and make a bold external commitment. And Laci, I'm sure that you've seen that across the global landscape.
Yeah, absolutely, Sabina. Yeah, thanks for that. That helped with the explanation there. And then, when we think back to the transparency discussion that, we've been having, what strikes me is there's at least two approaches to transparency. One I would call the I have to fix this, and the other one is this is the preferred fix. So for the have to fix, GPG compliance and reporting are a bare minimum, right? Regarding the preferred fix, that's where we want to see leadership, stepping in and taking it a step further beyond compliance and laying out an accountability plan for progress. when we think about closing the pay gaps themselves, we want to make sure we're building out a sustainable and a scalable plan. We'll see the benefits tenfold with regards to attraction and retention of top talent, and it will inevitably force us to look at our overall pay philosophy, proactively invest in revisiting our job profiles and our job descriptions, and cause us to revisit posted salary levels in order to improve rewards, our total reward strategy, in a much fairer manner across the entire workforce, for example. So this preferred fix approach, Sabina, in my opinion and experience in talking with senior HR and business leaders, clearly builds trust, and it shows leadership's measurable commitment to their people and to the future of diversity, equity, and inclusion and ESG in the organization. You know, in the UK here, global precedents for pay reporting and transparency, well, they've been set, and slowly other countries are beginning to follow suit. It's up to leaders now to go beyond just that bare minimum reporting, highlighting pay equity as a critical piece of the ESG agenda, showcasing how organizations may stand out over peers and in turn drive returns for the business impact, all of which we know investors have their eyes on. That is social progress, the S component of ESG. So HR leaders should review all elements of the employee value proposition, EVP, so many acronyms, not only for their investors, but arguably more importantly, as a signal to employees that leadership recognizes the importance of fairness, of objectivity, and of inclusivity in ensuring that compensation administration plays its part in the company's overall ESG efforts. So
you'll see, Laci, I might jump in and say what's really important to note here is the ESG landscape has historically been incredibly polarized, right? Only focusing on that impact investing or investor stewardship piece. So it's really interesting to hear from you the kind of empowering time for the people teams behind the scenes to really be a part of that broader agenda as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, you know, ESG is just, well, it's relatively, you know, a new area of focus, and it's so wildly important for this topic of equity and transparency. But, you know, as you can see here, it's not the only influencer of embracing pay transparency. Candidate and employee expectations, significantly more than compliance, are also driving transparency initiatives across all organizations. Take a look at the top bar. More than half, 52%, said employee expectations and 41% said candidate expectations, ahead of those who said legal requirements, just 31%, are drivers of transparency. HR leaders surveyed shared with us that listing pay ranges on job postings has led to more applications to more posted positions, has increased the quality of applicants that they get, and thus makes the organization more competitive in terms of attracting top talent. The employees survey told us that they are more likely, as you might imagine, to trust organizations that provide pay ranges in job postings versus ones that do not provide that information. And finally, a driver of pay transparency is leadership's belief, as we mentioned earlier, that it is simply the right thing to do. It makes good business sense. So notably, as seen in the bar, I believe second from the bottom here on this chart, about 40% of all leaders surveyed, you know, subscribe to that notion as well, that it, you know, that it's the right thing to do.
Great, Laci. Love to see a study where 100% agree that's the right thing to do, but we're inching closer. And we know pay equity is really the centerpiece of a fair and equal workplace. This is the work that you and I do together day in and day out, and kind of partner with these larger entities to build that case. But building an inclusive culture is requisite to that positive employee experience, driving attraction, retention, top talent. These themes are repetitive in the presentation today. But workforce practices still seem to marginalize select employee populations, right? Putting in blanket policies without consideration of the individual needs of each of the employees within their workforces. And even in the instances where we are assessing across this intersection, right, looking at gender differences, looking at racial, ethnic breakdown, there's still a significant gap in data availability, right? So I know you and I really focused on bringing this to light as well in this study. Data that comes out is only as strong as the data that goes in, right? Anyone with a data background will have heard that before. But with people data, we'll build this out a bit further later on, self-identification also stands in the way of true analysis and in turn thoughtful application. So that's where we start to see, listen, this is more than just a check the box activity. How are we encouraging people or our employees to talk about who they are and where their values are, especially in a previously opaque area or a sensitive topic like pay? The two most predominant reasons we see people choose not to self-identify: first, the fear of discrimination, which is fairly straightforward, just given the world that we live in, unfortunately. But second is the idea that even if I do disclose, my company's not going to do anything about it. So we have to really think about that when we start to put in place action steps to close those gaps, right? It's not just a gap, it is a significant perception gap. The perception gap, I think, is the key takeaway for us today, right? This is critical, frankly, not talked about enough. Economic reports continue to show Black and Hispanic workers, for example, being less than paid than white counterparts. We see this across all genders, orientation, ages, etc. And data becomes increasingly smart as you start to even address this, assess multiracial employees. So, a successful pay strategy really must take these differences into account. And our research confirms that employee experiences with compensation, which may not be so surprising, really does vary considerably based on how they identify. One size absolutely does not fit all. So if we look a bit more closely at the findings themselves, right, across several questions, our study found these perceptions of progress and commitment to pay equity really mirroring that of the differences in pay across race and ethnicity and age as well. For example, 62% of white respondents in the UK find their organizations are effective in achieving pay equity, while only 1/3 of Black and 1/2 of Asian individuals said the same. The picture is only slightly better in the US, right, with a half of Asian respondents and closer to 2/3 of the Hispanic and Black population saying that their organizations are effective. So this is a global issue with individualized needs, absolutely. We've heard this before. Globally, the gender gap persists with those identifying male, female, non-binary, and beyond, right? When organizations make those blanket policies without the deeper assessment into those root causes, they don't address those individualized needs. So our survey found that women earn less than men, right? This is a stat that we've heard, and it's pretty mind-blowing that we're still trying to solve for this, but most men agree, 76%, that they have a good understanding of how pay is determined at their organizations. Only 61% of women said the same, right? So we can see this direct connection between differences in pay and differences in understanding pay practices based on where they sit with regards to their own individual earnings. Across generation, right? So when we think about the world that we live in today, this is the most diverse workforce by far, not only across race and ethnicity and gender, but also across generations, right? So the Gen Z employees that we surveyed were by far the most likely to say better transparency across the company would increase their performance and productivity. They're making hiring decisions or placement decisions based on their values. Fewer Gen Z respondents, 58%, agree that they had a good understanding of how pay is determined at their organization than Gen X and millennials. This indicates that greater transparency really could unlock higher performance. And Laci, if you'll allow me to kind of speculate here, because I think this is such a critical stat, it's underscoring that you and I, we're not really just suggesting throwing money at the problem. That's a Band-Aid fix for what we're starting to unpack here. It's also not feasible. Many employees in this wave of burnout, quite simply, workplaces have never seen, and at this size and scale pre-pandemic, would suggest even if you pay them more, it would only be for the work that they're already doing, right? And this sentiment spans millennial respondents overwhelmingly. This consistent notion of I'm overworked and underpaid, and this population that's stuck in the middle, right? Fighting for what the youngest generations expect is absolute bare minimum and transparency. And we still see those older generations pushing back, saying you should be happy to be here, as opposed to we're happy to have you, right? And let's stop talking about this or making everyone uncomfortable talking about pay. And like I said, this is the first time we are seeing 5 generations in the workforce at the same time. Those younger populations set to completely completely take on the entire workforce within the next 5 years. So it really underscores that inclusivity element that we keep talking about, and companies are still not quite getting right.
Sabina, no matter how many times I see and hear and talk with you about these race, gender, age statistics that you just reviewed, not surprising. It's still just so disappointing. We just have so much more progress to make. Leaders know the importance of pay equity, but our survey shows that, as we've been saying, organizations are struggling to make it a reality. When it comes to a close examination of fair pay and the tools being applied to improve equity and transparency, many are stalled there and are significantly behind. So establishing fair pay practices relies on a detailed analysis of data so that organizations can accurately evaluate progress that they may be trying to make. Spreadsheets that track only employee ID and roles and associated pay, they just provide the barest of information. More than half, 55% of surveyed leaders say that complexities of pay equity analysis is the biggest challenge in addressing pay equity. And approximately that same number of HR leaders said, well, more than that, we're lacking access to employee demographic data as well. So an issue of data availability or lack thereof, not just an issue of analysis being a complex undertaking. So really what's needed are more robust employee workforce data and pay analytics that enable leadership with actionable insights so that they can take action to close equity gaps across the entire workforce. 3/4, more than 77% of senior business and HR leaders that we surveyed say that their organizations are conducting equity analysis to ensure employee salaries are in line internally and with salary ranges for new hires, but a full quarter don't do any analysis at all. Of those who do conduct equity reviews, done very infrequently, once or twice a year if we're lucky. More frequent analysis is far less common. When we asked, do you do it monthly? 10% of those surveyed said, yeah, put me in the monthly box. So, from the English lens, we know it's safe to assume companies review at a minimum annually for the purpose of GPG reporting. But in an ideal world, to close the gaps and sustain the progress over time, we want to consider more frequent analysis and application. Driving equity and parity really requires greater frequency when it comes to analyzing data and scrutinizing gaps, and that is especially true in an environment in which we all live today that is tumultuous and rapidly changing. Pay equity analysis, I think, as Sabina's already said, it can't be a one and done exercise. It's not a task to be checked off your to-do list. And while infrequent analyses of data and lack of pay data are holding back progress, many of the complexities of analysis could be solved by the application of technology. Yet most organizations have really been slow to adopt tools and automation. We talk about this all the time, Sabina, right? In fact, 59% are relying upon labor-intensive, manually driven tools like in-house spreadsheets. Add to that what appears to be, really limited, technical capability of HR teams to, one, use the tools, and then two, meaningfully interpret results. And it's really no surprise that progress on equity is still quite slow. So data and tools, infrequent analysis, they're not the only inhibitors of instantiating fair pay. Tradition, individual beliefs, organizational culture norms are also likely reasons for not addressing pay equity. Look at the qualitative data across this particular slide. I'm talking about things like discomfort talking about pay based on individual beliefs, or for fear of negative consequences, or leadership's direction that salary discussions are not to happen, and the like. All the quotes you see listed here from survey respondents that, we collected are interesting for sure, at the least, eye-opening more so. And that quote in the upper right-hand box, frankly, is totally alarming. I can't quite imagine working with an organization whose culture treats pay discussions among coworkers as gross misconduct. Wow. Sabina, such a culture I would describe as nothing better than toxic.
And Laci, I mean, the unfortunate reality is I think this is more common than uncommon, right? Even with laws globally to protect employees in place and foster the safe environment, culturally, we're just truly not seeing it yet. And I'm sure for our listeners today, they've unfortunately, I mean, I'd hope not, but I'm sure some of them found themselves in similar positions. So what's helpful from a data approach is let's show some numbers behind the scenes and get that conversation going. So data challenges and lack of technology enablement, they're not the only hindrance to pay equity progress, right? So much of this landscape is dependent on effective communication, right? So we see overwhelmingly across global respondents that pay equity progress is stalled by inadequate communication. I think it's arguably the most important component when we think about fostering an environment of trust, exactly dovetailing on what you were just saying, right? This safety in the workplace. And this is the trickle down effect that I've been alluding to, right? We started with that tone from the top, but as transparency increases, it's not realistic, excuse me, to only arm human resources with the tools to hold difficult conversations. Your employees, they're talking to their direct managers. You yourselves as listeners may be just coming in the door and talking to your line managers, not the CHRO of every company. So it's equally imperative that we're educating those line managers, equipping them with the information that they need to have those conversations around pay in a safe, healthy way. It plays a critical role in moving pay initiatives forward and building pay equity in an organization. We saw Edelman's Global Trust Barometer, for example, that globally employees do see business leaders as a unifying force in the world. So there's hope yet. And they really can bring people together in a meaningful way, right? Employees are looking to business leaders in a way that they historically have not done before. So there's an opportunity here to be more open and talking about pay and the journey, right? So we have to acknowledge that this is in fact a journey as we start these conversations. The high impact organizations take a stand on pay equity, define their internal strategies for establishing fair pay practices, and they boldly share their visions internally and externally, right? We already said millennials and Gen Z employees will comprise the majority of the workforce by 2025. This is bare minimum for them. And what you see on screen here, employee expectations were the highest driver for pay transparency among the senior leaders we surveyed, right? They simply cannot afford to keep those employees in the dark. And in terms of action, including a focused pay range for a job is one step organizations can take to communicate and demonstrate their commitment to transparency. We're seeing that in the US as an example, requirements by law cross state. But in the UK, again, just adding that visibility and communication skills, about half of respondents of the survey said that even an organization or their company where they have access to public pay ranges and that visibility, the ranges themselves are too broad to be meaningful, right? Only 53% of those companies actually post job roles internally, and nearly as many as 49% include those pay ranges. So still less than half of your population that has access to the information, and even still, it's not meaningful in terms of understanding where they sit within this broader discussion. And this is one of my favorite slides. This is what we were starting to get at earlier. Progress is stalled because of the lack of individual manager employee discussions around pay. This is kind of the crux of the perception gap that we keep talking about. Conversations of pay equity can get uncomfortable, emotionally charged, especially when an employee identifies they're being paid less than their peers, and when a manager carries out an outmoded belief that it's not appropriate to raise concerns about compensation. It's just adding fuel to the fire. So whatever the reason, let's consider this. The senior and HR business leaders that we surveyed said 68% of managers are having effective conversations with their teams, and only 6% neglect to have them at all. So on the left-hand side of the screen here, managers think they're doing great. They're having these conversations. But if we move to the right side, employees surveyed report that only a third of managers have effective conversations, right? That 35%. And nearly a quarter don't have conversations with them at all. Of the few that do, 20% of those discussions are ineffective or very ineffective. So training leaders and managers can help build comfort and capability around these potentially difficult conversations. That's a start, absolutely. But next, leaders and managers really need to be held accountable for having open conversations. This is a key part of the foundation for more inclusive and equitable cultures. It's really where we start to see pay equity as a driver, but again, just part of this broader equality puzzle that we're really trying to solve for. Creating an inclusive culture means ensuring the effectiveness and frequency of one-to-one and team conversations, along with aligned messages from senior executives. There's so much room for confusion here. So this is really where we start to see, again, that empowerment of the HR function, right? Acting as a strong support for business leaders, coaching them and providing them with the data and benchmarks to have more productive conversations, strengthening relationships with their teams, and in turn, overall productivity and a fairer future of work.
Yeah, Sabina, I know we have to move on to the calls to action section, but I'm still thinking about what you were talking about when you were sharing the pay range information on the slide before that one. Just yesterday, I was having a conversation with the owner of a, kind of an executive level staffing agency. And he was telling me that the pay ranges that are posted for many of the organizations that he supports are absolutely not meaningful. The data you shared was like, 50% of orgs on average post ranges, but 40% of those ranges aren't meaningful. What do you mean aren't meaningful? Well, this position is paid between $80,000 and $275,000. I mean, come on, right? That's what we mean by not meaningful. So he was talking about how he was having discussions with their total rewards, leaders, their chief people officer, and some other business leaders there to say, hey, can you think about narrowing the range a little bit more so that I can get some realism here. So yesterday this happened, not 24 hours ago, Sabina.
And Laci, it's exactly right. It's happening every day. What we saw in the past few months to a very large multinational posting a range for $0 to $2 million. So one, how do I make meaning of that? And two, who's starting at $0, right? Let's put some thought into what we're posting out there. So definitely a learning curve for us all.
Right. And the companies were saying to him, well, I posted the pay ranges. You told me to post pay ranges. So not a check the box activity.
It has to be real. Exactly right. Let's jump to calls to action, because I think what we find between the two of us is it's a lot of talk in the space, but how do we actually drive this forward?
Yeah, exactly. So, in driving forward, it's critical to remind ourselves of the people behind the numbers, right? Data analysis allows us always to set a foundation for equity in the organization, to have the right discussions, to get people to sit up and pay attention because those numbers are alarming, but to move away from outmoded practices. Considering the individual voices within your org is critical for a scalable plan for progress. Fair pay and greater pay transparency, they're critical in shaping a human-centric organization, which I would venture to say all of us on the line here today are trying to strive towards that. Putting people first helps enhance the employee experience. It improves attraction and retention, prepares the organization for long-term sustainability. As leaders work to refine their pay equity strategy and create more accountability around it, they should first determine the interconnected nature of the pay equity transparency work and how those actions fit into their overall people strategy. Equity and transparency influence every single component of this human-centric workplace, picture that you see here on the screen, to align with advancing the employee experience, to nurturing this people-first culture that is prevalent today, and driving towards a fairer future for work for all. We distilled 5 kind of calls to action from our research study. Here, the first one is get stakeholders aligned, right? Setting the tone for fair pay and transparency at the top is imperative, as Sabina already mentioned, equally crucial that it resonates throughout the entire workforce. We see a clear disconnect between HR and business leaders when it comes to those practices, as we've already shared. Whatever policies key stakeholders put in place at the leadership level, including any influence of boards of directors, the goals, the objectives, and the expected outcomes should be clearly articulated. All leaders, not just those in HR, are accountable for progress. Because why? This is a business imperative, not an HR to do. So that underscores the need for alignment across all business functions. So really, this first call to action, get stakeholders aligned. There's a couple of items that we suggest you can do. Help leadership team understand and build consensus on the implications of pay inequity and lack of transparency on the employee experience. Empower key stakeholders with pay equity and transparency data and enable them with tools beyond in-house spreadsheets to make informed decisions and lead conversations. Ensure that your total reward strategy reflects the values of all within the organization, specifically addressing individualized needs prevalent across a diverse employee population.
Absolutely. And Laci, you have your stakeholders, right? You've identified who's critical in these conversations. And now what we're seeing overwhelmingly is it's no longer operation in silo. We need to make sure that we're bringing all teams together. So what do we do, right? In terms of execution, now that's the next step. You have all of your stakeholders aligned, but shortchanging our pay equity strategies or only making quick fixes, reactive shuffling of pay ranges, one-time bonus payouts, that won't work, right? This is a Band-Aid fix. And what we want to be absolutely crystal clear is this is not an equality program. This is not a nice to have or an addition to an ERG resource group, employee resource group, excuse me. This is business imperative, which again, we've said nearly every slide by now. So we cannot treat it as a Band-Aid fix, hard and fast. If we do, the progress is temporary. We see short-term results, and instead, leadership really must treat this as a strategic initiative requisite to attraction and retention and long-term success. So when we look at the 3 steps on screen here, like any critical business function, we want to move away from the performative behaviors by executing a clear business strategy for achieving and sustaining equity across the business. And we would never present outside of a business a strategy without key performance indicators, right? So we want to make sure we're incorporating metrics of success beyond compliance numbers and regulatory standards. Consider themes such as pay discrepancies, promotion rates, pipeline, which you mentioned earlier, and set a regular cadence for pay review to combat complacency. It's not one and done. And lastly, we're holding all of our managers accountable, right? We want to foster an inclusive workplace. Linking inclusion goals and team sentiment to performance metrics is one way that we might look to do that.
Yeah, thanks, Sabina. So, and then, thirdly, beyond a business imperative and stakeholder alignment, redefine pay philosophies, right? Go back to those quotes. That's what we're talking about. A company's fundamental pay philosophy is a direct reflection of their commitment or lack thereof to employees. So as such, organizations must address, systemic barriers that historically may have influenced pay disparities and redefine their total philosophy to ensure bias, conscious or unconscious, is not perpetuated over and over. Needs, values, priorities of the workforces, they've changed significantly. So we need to jettison traditional performance management and pay practices that marginalize specific groups of employees. You know what I'm talking about. Understand, assess, and redefine pay, determining characteristics as needed in favor of a much more modern and equitable approach to pay, ensuring that all are given an equal opportunity to succeed and to flourish. So this third call to action around traditional pay philosophies redefined, we can do this by, one, just becoming familiar with knowing the impact of pay inequity on employee attraction, on engagement, on retention, as well as the overall employee experience. Also be realistic about where you are today. Being open, being honest about historic shortcomings, that fosters authenticity and trust with the employees and allows you to move forward. And then finally, understand, the needs of employees. Seek to do that. Introduce qualitative assessment of employee sentiment to truly understand the diverse needs of your organization. So, this is so easy to say out loud and, much more challenging to execute. It takes leaders that are truly human-centric leaders that have a desire to want to fix things and care about employees.
Absolutely, absolutely. And as we think about the action items, Laci, we've already talked about data gaps and technology kind of standing in the way here, but ready access to pay and demographic data is holding up progress on advancing pay equity and strategic business lever, right? Those KPOs require data to define our metrics of success. So a data-driven approach to pay equity requires organizational investment in technology, truthfully, and a zero tolerance culture for unfair pay practices. Transformation may take time, but it should not be overwhelming. And always on technological solutions build efficiencies in data analysis, remediation planning, process sustainability, and scaling. These efficiencies allow us to then shift our resources and focus from data collection and cleansing to the people themselves, right? Addressing those needs that we keep talking about, focusing on larger policies and benefits for the organization. So we want to encourage you all really to think about data and technology as an efficiency here, right? We can do this by piloting data-driven technical solutions to identify those root causes of pay inequities, informing where action needs to take place. This helps us to prioritize. Where do we start? We want to consider contributing factors, including both protected characteristics, right? So those racial, ethnic categorizations, gender associations, orientation, ability. I mean, the list really can go on, but also those pay contributing factors like performance, tenure, location. Understanding where those barriers exist allow us to investigate those opportunity gaps, as I just mentioned. And lastly, we want to ensure. Yep. Sorry. Go ahead, Laci.
Oh no. I just wanted to ask you a question, but you're still going ahead. So please.
We want to just ensure measurable action drives authentic change. So we want to ultimately define and ultimately execute these remediation plans. If we've publicized them, we now have to act, right? You found a gap. Now what? I've asked this time and time again. Now is the time to work to close them.
Yeah, thanks, Sabina. You nailed just what I was about to ask you. I jumped the gun there. It's great to set plans, but if we don't execute, then they don't see the progress. But I loved how you called out the fact that it could take time, but it shouldn't be overwhelming. And taking time is it. It's like we didn't get here overnight. We're not going to fix it overnight. And as demanding as employees are today, and boy they are, right, and they have high expectations. As long as they see progress, we're going to be in a good spot. It's when, it's lip service, as opposed to execution, the walking the talk that you started our discussion with. So the fifth call to action that Sabina and I talked about as we looked at our survey results were, as you might imagine, coach leaders. Holy moly, it's what a time today to be an HR leader. So much more on our plates than ever in the past, with truly no blueprint for how to progress forward. So we need to help them through. And, once we have the senior team aligned and clear on the strategic importance of equity and transparency for the business, communication, needs to go mainstream. The studies show that transparent communication builds trust and credibility, and clear and consistent and regular and honest messaging to employees demonstrates, again, leadership's commitment and sets the stage for more open and honest conversations across the organization. It creates that kind of human-centric culture that will attract and keep the top talent today. So alongside communication from senior leaders, frontline managers are increasingly tasked with these difficult conversations around pay. As Sabina said, likely employees aren't going to the CHRO or chief of people to have these discussions. They're, having them with their direct manager. So organizations have a responsibility to prepare managers with the tools, the support that they need to lead authentic dialogue and eliminate discomfort around the historically sensitive topic. You can't change person's feelings. So even if you're a manager, you might feel discomfort. But if we give them some coaching about how to bring the right behaviors forward to those conversations so that they can get through those conversations feeling less discomfort, that's progress. So this fifth call to action in coaching leaders is really to build their capability to communicate transparently, regularly, realistically, and comfortably in uncomfortable topics of discussion, right? So how do they do that? They can start by lead by listening, coach and train managers to have these difficult conversations with empathy, help them remember to provide the space for those diverse voices to be heard, to be empowered. Be committed to publishing clear pay levels and associated expectations, and behaviors for those roles. And then after you do that, be committed to explaining what that means for employees. And then, finally, ensure managers are fostering a safe environment where employees feel comfortable, asking for clarity around their pay without fear of repercussion. And make sure before that, we've given the right support to managers so they feel comfortable. So I think that wraps up the last of our calls to action, Sabina. Yeah.
It does. And I love that we end with lead by listening and being realistic, right? I think first and foremost, acknowledging that this is a journey and everyone may be starting at a different place. We don't need to hear everyone talk about how great they are. We need to talk about the real happenings, right? What's going on. So we really encourage you all to use data to help kind of drive that narrative. But first and foremost, give yourself grace, understand where you all are, and be realistic about those priorities to move forward. So, Laci, it's always a pleasure. I know you and I love to roll our sleeves up and get into the data. So just really looking forward to continuing the conversation. I
Likewise.
think we'll pass it back to Robert.
Laci and Sabina, thank you so much for such an insightful talk. I think we have time for just one or two questions. As we do that, can I draw viewers' attention to the poll on your screen, which is about to appear? I think it's there. This is about top priorities for HR professionals. We would like to be able to help you to explore customized solutions to the issues raised today by offering a demonstration or discussion. If you could indicate what most interests you in that list, that would be really helpful. You can select multiple answers. And again, if you haven't already downloaded the ebook about the research presented today, you may still do so if you're so minded from the link in the chat. Thank you. Right. So, Laci, I have a question for you first. I'm sorry, I don't know who sent the question in, but do you have any tips on sharing data to engage employees whilst managing expectations?
Thank you for that question. And thank you for getting it over to us, Robert. I guess I go back to kind of one of the last winning practices that Sabina and I were sharing, when it comes to anything, and particularly compensation that's so personal to employees, I'd say communication is key. It's vital in ensuring that your employees know why they're paid the way they are. It really helps to keep everyone on the same page, and doing so will boost morale, improve engagement and satisfaction, all while reducing the risk of turnover of key talent, due to awarded compensation falling short of employees' expectations. So, as part of that compensation or part of that communication, share the org's pay philosophy to achieve a fair and structured pay process, and remind employees of the additional benefits or incentives that come with their base pay. As Sabina said, it's more than just base pay. Often that piece of the total reward strategy is overlooked by leadership, sort of taken for granted, and therefore not communicated to employees, and so it's not prominent in their minds. You can also share market data with them. Let them know how their pay at their organization compares to what other organizations of similar size, of location, of jobs with similar responsibility and experience are paying, so that they've got a level of comfort, so that. Oh boy, did I just hear a beep that we're at the top of the hour? So I hope that answered the question. I don't know if Sabina has anything to add before I know we have to wrap.
I think that's exactly right. I think the one component I would add is data at face value can be the numbers themselves, but it also can be those metrics of success, right? Exactly as we said earlier. So thinking about job leveling, thinking about your pay philosophy, and being able to articulate to your employees, what does it take? What are our values and what are the skills required to move up in a job level that we can then associate with pay, really just help to arm those conversations more thoughtfully. So it's a long journey, Laci, as we see.
Absolutely.
So yes, unfortunately, I think we're out of time then. So it just remains to say thank you once again to our speakers, Laci Loew and Sabina Mehmood, and thank you to you for joining us. And we look forward to seeing you at future webinars.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.